the nation, the man, the nation, the people that would become Israel. And last week we looked at the forefather, Jacob, and how his name was changed to Israel on an unusual night when he wrestled with God. And he takes on this new name to become the new nation that was promised long ago to his forefather, Abraham. You know, a few years ago, I was asked to do a funeral for a family that the wife and the sons attended church at Northwest there, but he had never much attended. And I knew him from a few times we were around, but I wouldn't say that I was a personal friend of him, but the family asked me to do that. And when I did the service for them, I mentioned that, and I said, I came to know him through his sons. And many people told me afterwards, they say there's probably no better way to know somebody than through their sons, through their children. In essence, those two boys were a strong reflection of their dad, his values, the things that he did, his sense of humor. They were, equally entwined between both of those boys. Tonight we're going to be looking at Israel, but we're going to be doing so through the lens of his sons. And some actions that they do, some how Israel himself handles it. And it gives us a picture of the man and the men whom this nation would become of. Last week you probably noticed as we looked at Jacob, he was not a man that we would sit here and hold up as being the most stellar figure. I mean, he had lived most of his life as a con artist. He was known for, he was a man that seemingly was always in a bit of trouble because of something that he had done. But yet God chose him to be the man whom his people would be named after. And there's an incident that occurs in Genesis chapter 34 that tells a little bit, adds a little bit to that story. It's not a passage that we normally spend so much time in, but I think it's a significant to help us understand the sons of Israel. In Genesis chapter 34, in verses 1 through 6, we read of a terrible incident involving Diana, who was the daughter of Israel, Jacob, through Leah, who was the other sister. And it basically happened to people of that land. And in so she meets one of the sons of one of the princesses of that land, a man by the name of Hamor. He is infatuated with her. And in the process, he violates her. The text here that reads in verses 1 through 6 talks about how he lay with her by force. But in the next verse, it talks about how he loved her and spoke tenderly to her. And it's kind of a strange idea. What was this guy doing and thinking? Especially when you consider in a few verses that he proposes marriage to her to her father. Well, we don't know the exact nature of what happened in this, but we do know that this was a young man. He was used to getting what he wanted. And it wasn't as if probably he was, I don't want to say this wrong, but he liked her. He wanted to be with her, but he obviously didn't stop with what he should do. Well, after this incident occurs, of course, the father, who is a prince of the land, knows how dangerous of a situation this has become. And so he sends word to Jacob to procure Diana as a wife for his son. It tells us in verse 5 that when Jacob heard about it, he kept silent until the brothers came in. In other words, he wasn't instantly causing a ruckus. Look what we read in verse 7. It says, when the sons of Jacob came in from the field and they heard it, the men grieved, for they were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not be done. For Jacob, he understands how delicate of a situation is about to happen. If the brothers react in a certain way, well, it could mean war. But yet at the same time, a terrible crime has been committed. What will they do? For Jacob, he seems to play it on the down low, but the brothers are upset. It says they're very angry because of what had happened. But I want you to notice the wording of that passage. Read it again. When the sons of Jacob came in from the field, when they heard it, the men were grieved, and they were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by laying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not be done. That phrase there, such a thing should not be done. Wasn't right. But notice where it says it should not be done. In Israel. Where is Israel at this moment? There is no Israel in terms of a place, right? Jacob is Israel. In fact, we'll notice that those two words, Jacob and Israel, get used synonymously. We'll talk about that some more later. But it says here that the sons of Jacob, they were upset by this because such a thing not be done in Israel. But there wasn't an Israel yet. That nation hadn't been founded. Now, the start of it was there, right? The patriarch Jacob, who was given the name Israel, his 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes, right? It was the start of it, but why that phrase? Well, you might probably think that, that was more of a phrase that would be added by the writers later. The text here would be written later. Tradition says it was given by Moses, wrote this history down. But even then, it's still not Israel, right? But yet it's almost like we have a phrase today like, this is America, to describe, there's certain privileges and rights, and we kind of use it retroactively almost to a degree. But I think there's some significance in that. The idea here that the sons of Jacob know this is not what God planned for his people. That a daughter of Jacob should just be treated so poorly. That this kind of act would be, they're upset. But as we can see starting in verse 8, we begin to see that the father of Hamor is trying to settle things down. In verse 8 it says, Hamor spoke with him, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs, give us your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. Thus you shall live with us, and the land will be open to you. Live and trade in it, and acquire property in it. What's he trying to do here? Well, he's trying to propose an alliance. I think it's important here to look in the larger context of it. We're not just talking about family squabbles, but it is. But these are talking about people who are the government even of themselves, right? Their power lies in their tribe and their people. Jacob, even with his 12 sons and all that he's acquired, is still a rather minor player in this region. He hasn't lived there long. He's in their land. He's a man that controls this region. And he's extending here an olive branch. Hey, this situation isn't good, but my son wants her for a wife. He can bring her in. We can marry our daughters to your sons to our daughters. We can form a coalition, an alliance. We can come together, and in it will benefit you. You'll be able to trade. You'll be able to acquire wealth. You'll be able to live, not like nomads, but have a place to live and to stay. Surely that would be something that they would want. Look at verse 11. It said, Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, if we find favor in your sight, then I will give you whatever you say to me. If you look at that, when he first speaks, you can tell that there is a divide, a father and the brothers, right? He first speaks to the father, then he speaks to the brothers. Whatever you want, whatever's good in your sight. For Jacob, as the leader of the family, it's got to be a whale of a deal. This man who's going to fix the problem. He's going to pay a restitution. He's going to provide for them. But for the brothers, it's a little bit more difficult of a deal because they're looking at it not from the perspective of someone who is concerned about everything, but just about their sister. Later on in verse 30, we'll see Jacob is so concerned about being attacked, the actions that are going to come about. He's going to say, so Hamor to him is saying all the right things in order to make this situation from a negative to a positive. But for the brothers, they have somewhat of a different response. Look at verse 13. It says, "But Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit, because he had defiled their sister." You see, they don't want to hear anything about what he has to say. They don't want to make peace. They want revenge for what he has done to their sister. And that's exactly what they do. What they tell him is they say, well, we're willing to do this, but we just can't marry our sister off to anyone who is uncircumcised. The circumcision was the covenant that was established with Abraham. It was a physical act to represent the promise that God had made. And it was something that was handed down to his sons. And even this day, that was the symbol that made a Jew, made someone part of this promise, right? But it's interesting because they're not using this because of religious conviction. They're using religious conviction as an excuse, right? They're using this as a way to catch these men in a state where they can't fight back. Because by requiring them to be circumcised, they're going to undergo that act, and it's going to take a little time for them to recover. And what ends up happening is people, by requiring that all of them become circumcised, and in that process of doing that, that leaves them vulnerable to an attack. And that's exactly what they have in mind. They take this thing that was given to them by God, this religious symbol, and they use it pretty underhandedly to take on Hamor and his sons. And so basically that's what they do. While they are in a state they can't fight, they go in and they attack him and all his family. They loot his tents. They take away all the things from him. And in doing so, they are able to get revenge on the actions that came against their Simeon and Levi. "You have brought trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And my men being few in number, they will gather together with me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household." This is Jacob's word. Now will gain the ire of all the people who live around them. And they are too small to protect themselves. There's no way they'll stand up against the combined effort of all these people who were connected to Hamor and his people. And Jacob's fearful. But notice their response in verse 31. "But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot?" Well, who's right? I mean, Jacob here is trying to look at the big picture. He's trying to protect more than just one life. He's trying to see beyond just the one moment. But in doing so, he's basically thrown his daughter away. The brothers look at this and say, this shouldn't be done. This isn't right. There is a crime here. There's a problem. He has defiled our sister. He has treated her with contempt. They deserved the punishment that was coming to them. And it puts the whole family into this quandary. It's interesting as we look at the relationship between Jacob and his sons. oftentimes we see a lot of conflict, and I think a lot of that came out of the way that they all came about. Jacob had a preferred wife, and the wife he was stuck with. He had the many sons that came. Here he specifically talks to Simeon and Levi, who seem to be the ones who were the instigators of this. He singles those two out. But it seems like all the brothers were on board with this. It would take them all to go and do what they did. And terrible. It goes back to that line, this just not about be done. And for Jacob, who is just now feeling safe in his new environment, because remember, when he came here, he was terrified of his brother Esau. But now that's been resolved. Now he has a whole new set of enemies, a whole new problem. Which takes us to chapter 35 and verse 1. It says, Then God said to Jacob, Arise and go up to Bethel, and live there, and make an altar there to God, whom appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Go back to Bethel. So Jacob, verse 2, so Jacob and has said to his household garments, Let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and all the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak tree which was near Shechem. What does Jacob do? Well, God speaks to him and tells him, I want you to go back to Bethel. What's so special about Bethel? Bethel was the name that Jacob gave the place. It was also known as Luz. It was the area that he went to when he was running from Esau. He was trying to get to Laban. He goes there, and God speaks to him and makes to him that first time he hears the promise of what God has a plan for him. Bethel was a sacred place. It was when he was connected to God. Now, it didn't mean God had fully went with Laban, and he kind of falls back into old ways. We see his activities with Laban, and it's him once again trying to con and figure things out. We see the same thing with his brother. We see it now with the way his sons are acting towards the men of Shechem. But we also notice something else. What does it tell us in verse 2? What had they collected on their journey? All the trinkets that were associated with the different beliefs and religions of the people they had been under. Even when he leaves the house of Laban, right? He takes some of those gods with him, those idols. Now when they're with Shechem, this whole incident starts. Why? Because Diana goes to the people of that area to talk with them, to see with them, to visit the daughters of that land. They got real comfortable with all the people and all their beliefs that were going on all around them. So God tells him to go back to Bethel. Go back to where it started. Go back to where I first spoke to you. Go back to the beginning. And the first thing Jacob does is says, if we're going to go back to Bethel, if we're going to go back to the beginning, we have to get rid of all this other stuff. All these idols, all these rings, all these things that were connections that we had, he takes and he buries in the ground in Shechem. He goes to the oak tree and he throws them all in. He says, we're not taking any of this stuff with us. We're leaving it behind. And he goes back to Bethel. It's interesting because in the next verse, in verse 5, it tells us that as they journeyed, there was a great terror among the cities which were around him, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. What was his biggest fear? Boys, you've attacked these guys, and now everybody's going to rise up and come after us. All these people are going to look and say, these people are treacherous. You don't want to deal with them. But yet now, not through any power of their own, no one comes after them. Because God watches over him. As he seeks to go back to Bethel, he's protected. Nobody's coming for him. He doesn't have to worry about things catching back up to him. In verse 6 it says, "So Jacob came to Luz, which is Bethel, which is the land of Canaan, and he and all his people who were with him. And he built an altar there, and called the place El Bethel. He had fled from his brothers." He goes back to the place. El Bethel is the El that signifies the name God. It's God's place. It's the house of God. That's how that could literally be translated there. Now, he's come back to where it started. Let's skip down to verse 9. There's a couple things that happen in those other verses. But in verse 9 we get back to kind of this narrative. It says, "Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came to Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, 'Your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name.' And thus he called him Israel. 'Many of nations will come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. And the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you.' And God went up from him in the place where he had spoken to him." Wait a minute. God had already done this, right? We studied this last week, right? God had already changed his name. So why does God make a point here of saying, "I'm changing your name. You're no longer Jacob, but you're Israel"? Right? Jacob, he who grasps by the heel, he who trips people up. To Israel, who is a prince of God, king. Jacob and Israel are used interchangeably throughout the text. Even though God gives him this new name, he always seems to go back and forth between it. God has a habit of changing people's name. Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah, right? We've seen that name, that significance of giving someone a name. But it seems like with Jacob, it's the name that, when he changes his name to Israel, it doesn't stick. For example, if you go to Genesis chapter 46, verse 2, it says that God spoke to Israel. And then he said to him, "Jacob, Jacob." Even like God has trouble getting that name right? I had a girl that I knew in high school. She went by her middle name when she was in high school. When she went to college, she decided she was going to start going by her first name. And I knew her in both places, so it would always throw me off. But it was always funny because I could always tell when people knew her by what they called her, right? They knew her in high school, they called her this. But for some reason, Jacob and Israel seem to go back and forth. And it got me to thinking about that earlier passage when the sons of Jacob said this shouldn't happen in Israel. Why did God? Because I think you see the issue here. Sometimes he's Jacob and sometimes he's Israel. Sometimes he's the man he was. Always on the run. Always concocting a scheme. Always trying to figure his way out of a problem that he's got himself into. And then sometimes he's Israel. A man who is being led by God, who's fulfilling the promise of God, who is now being protected by God. Maybe it's the difference between what we should be and what we sometimes are. The sons of Israel are acting a lot like the man Israel, like Jacob. They're taking things in their own hands, right? And maybe a lot of it came about because they had gotten so disconnected from the promise of God. You think all the way back to Abraham, when Abraham goes and rescues Lot from the kings that had taken him, and when it comes time to divide the spoils and everything, Abraham's not going to take anything from them. And God said, because I don't want anybody to say, I made you, Abraham. Oh, Abraham only got rich because we gave him this. Jacob was considering, hey, I can make my way by uniting myself with these people. I can take on their gods. I can intermarry with them. It'll make me successful. It'll bring me power. It will take care of my problems. That wasn't God's promise, was it? God's promise would come when Jacob would trust in God. When he listens to him and says, I want you to go back to Bethel. I want you to go back to the beginning. I want you to start over. I want you to get rid of all the false idols you've built up and all the connections that you've made. Leave those behind. You bury them in the ground and you move to something else. You move towards the land that I had promised you, that I promised your father, that I promised your grandfather. Canaan, promised land. The fulfillment of everything that I've told you I'll do for you. But in order for that to happen, you've got to move away from these people. You've got to go somewhere else. Jacob, at this moment, is something that he's already told them, right? There's nothing new in this passage. He's told them he will become a nation. He's told them he's going to give him this land. All of these promises are repetitive, right? We've heard them before. He's heard them before. Abraham's heard them before. But they may seem very different to us at different points in our lives. For a man who is now looking and seeing the problems that have come about with his sons and daughters, for a man now completely unsure about what's going to happen to his promises. I've told you what I'm going to do, Jacob. I'm going to make you to Israel. I'm going to make you something more. And it's a reminder for Jacob, not necessarily anything new, but rather to get your way. The sons of Israel said, well, we got to protect ourselves, so we're going to do this underhandedly. We're going to use something that God gave us as not a means to fulfill the promise of God, but rather to undermine our enemies. You know, sometimes people do that. They look at God not as a God to be revered and served, but rather a tool to get what they want. I would talk about that, those people that think that godliness is a means of great gain. I mean, people today use religion not because out of a... That's not what God demands of his people. He demands faith and trust and belief. And that's what Jacob needed to have. If he was really going to become Israel, if he really was going to change himself, he had to go back to God's promises, to get rid of the land here and start his journey to that promised land. You can see, obviously, there's some metaphors that apply to us today. You see, God demands of us, too, a fundamental shift in who we are. The old man Jacob, man of sin, to the new man of faith. In order to do that, what do we have to do? We have to get rid of some things, right? We have to put some of those false idols and those things that we've brought in around us, and we have to bury them and leave them behind. And we have to go on a different journey, right? Out of this land and heading to that promised land. God's promises don't change, but they do change us. When we do that, it's amazing how messes that we've got ourselves into, God can step in and control, keep on the right course. Sometimes we need to go back to Bethel. Go back to where it all started. Go back to the beginning, to the keys, to the fundamentals. It's interesting because, it mentions in that one of the sons here that was the head of it was Simeon. And when I was reading this story, the New Testament corollary to me was Simon in Acts chapter 8. Simon the sorcerer is a man who responds to the gospel. Here's the preaching of Philip, and he is baptized and added to the church. But seemingly 2 minutes after he's baptized, he's in the wrong again. He steps right out of the water and goes in the wrong direction. In this case, when he sees the gifts of the Holy Spirit being laid out by the hands of the apostles, he thinks, if I could do that, I'd be special. Because in his former life, that's what he did. He was known as a magician. He was known as someone who was amazing and could do things no one else did, and he still wants to be that person. So he offers Peter and the disciples money. Hey, I will pay you a good sum of money if you can give me this gift of God. Give me this authority to lay hands on everyone. Because any good magician knows the trick is so much better if they do it in their hands. And if I could make people have this, that'd be somebody amazing. Right? Just like sons of Jacob used the covenant that had been given them to undermine people, that's exactly what Simon was going to do. Peter's response to him is in Acts chapter 8, verse 20, when he says, "May your silver perish with you because you thought you could obtain the gift of God with money. You have no part or portion in this matter, for your heart is not right before God." Simon was supposed to have been changed, but yet he's reverting back to what he was before. So in verse 22, he tells him, "Therefore repent of this wickedness of yours, and pray that the Lord, if possible, the intentions of your heart may be forgiven you. For I see that you are in the gall of bitterness and the bondage of iniquity." Simon, you better pray that God will forgive you. That God will forgive you, and more difficult, that your heart will change. It's not that it's hard for God to forgive, but it's definitely hard for your heart to be changed, the intentions of your heart. You got to make a deep down change. Because you're trapped. The gall of bitterness, the bondage of iniquity. Sometimes we get in the same boat as Simon. We get so caught up in the things of this world. We get so caught up in who we are and what we want to be. Maybe it's fame and fortune, whatever it is, that we miss out on the promise that God has made us. Same way I think Jacob was. I got to make this deal with this guy so I can keep my family intact, so I can achieve all these things. But what both of them needed to do was trust in God and change their thinking to get back to the start. Simon answered and said, "Pray for me yourself so that nothing you have said will come upon me." Simon asked for them to pray for him. Jacob went back to Bethel. Because both men needed help in becoming the men that they were supposed to be. When we look at the journey of Jacob to becoming Israel, the man, and the nation of Israel, we don't always see someone going in the perfect direction. We see through his sons, sometimes their behavior is not so great. But yet what we see in this journey is that God is still there for him. Remember what Jacob said? Where I saw God who's been with influence to where God wants us to be so he can bless us and